Hello and welcome to this AP4D Symposium on what does it look like for Australia to be a partner for infrastructure with the Pacific and with Southeast Asia. My name is Melissa Conley-Tyler and I'm the Executive Director of the Asia Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue, AP4D. I'm joining you today from the land of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people here in Canberra, Australia. And I pay my respects to elders past and present and any Indigenous people who are joining us today. For your interest, we recently hosted at AP4D an excellent discussion with Australia's new Ambassador for First Peoples, Justin Mohammed. So if you're interested in watching that and hearing more about Australia's work in First Nations foreign policy, please do look at our YouTube channel. So thank you so much to all of the people who have joined us here today. We were delighted that almost 200 people have registered either to watch this live or to watch it afterwards. And so can I extend a warm welcome on behalf of AP4D's co-chairs, Michael Wesley and Mark Purcell. They are not a conglomerate, even if I made it sound like it, and all of the AP4D team and advisory group. And we're delighted that we've got people coming from so many different backgrounds who are joining us here today. I think emphasising the point that infrastructure is a topic that crosses the different arms of statecraft. It's equally a development, diplomacy and defence issue, as well as the other things that don't start with D, like trade, economy, etc. So what we're going to be doing today is I'll start by telling you a little bit more about AP4D and who we are. We're still a new initiative, much as I love so many of the people who've been working with us for over our working groups are here. I'm sure there are people who are coming to us for the first time. We'll then outline the process that produced this particular paper, looking at infrastructure. We're then delighted to have three of the experts who helped work on this paper come and join us here today. And then finally, we'll get a policymaker response. So we're really privileged that Senator Birmingham, the Shadow Foreign Affairs Minister, has decided he can join us today and give his response to the paper. Now, because we also want to hear your views, we have Q&A enabled. At any point, you can put in your questions, your comments, your reactions in there, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. Also note that today's webinar is being live captioned, and if you would like to view the captions, just please click in the app on the show captions icon on the meetings control toolbar. So hopefully that will be useful if you're in a noisy environment or would find it easier. So I'm now sharing my screen just so I can tell you a little bit about AP4D and who we are. So we are still a very new initiative, and I'm conscious of that all the time. We were established as very much as a tripartite initiative. So we're housed at the Australian Council for International Development as the peak body, one of the peak bodies for the development sector. And then we're funded from the Defence Portfolio by the Australian Civil Military Centre and from Foreign Affairs through Office of the Pacific and DFI Maritime Southeast Asia. And the concept is that we bring together experts from across the Ds and other things that don't start with D to put our combined firepower on a particular problem, seeing it from multiple perspectives and seeing what sort of ideas we can come up with. And so we've been very active in our 2 years to date. We've done a series of papers looking at Southeast Asia and the Pacific, as well as papers that are looking at particular countries like Timor-Leste, or particular issues like illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, or women, peace and security. So if you haven't seen all of those papers, do feel free, go to the website, see some of what we've been able to produce. And if I may say, the only reason we've been able to produce any of this is because of the early support of the Australian Civil Military Centre, which loved the idea, gave us seed funding for a year to see if there was interest, to get people from across the sectors talking, and if we had ideas, would policymakers be interested? So to tell you a little bit more about ACMC and why I decided to support this initiative, I'll turn over to Nicola Rosenblum, who's the Executive Director of the Australian Civil Military Centre. Over to you, Nicola.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Lovely to see everyone here today online. I'm also speaking to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations people participating today. So the Australian Civil Military Centre's role is to build engagement across civil, military and police sectors to improve crisis response. And part of our mandate is to foster and support research on issues which can benefit from these diverse perspectives. And so in supporting AP4D, we were looking to really harness that thinking from the development, diplomacy and defence sectors to develop policy options that government could consider on thorny issues. So this cross-sectoral approach has been used to develop a range of innovative ideas and approaches across some of the biggest challenges that Australia and the region faces today. So today, I'm really looking forward to hearing a bit more about the research AP4D has conducted on partnering for infrastructure with Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Thanks very much, Melissa. Back to you.
And thank you again. It is no exaggeration to say that none of this would be possible without you. So I do want to tell you a little bit about how we arrived at this paper as well as what it says. So I think the reason we chose infrastructure as a topic is it's a clear issue across foreign policy. You can see mentions and interest in infrastructure in everything from the new international development policy, the Defence Strategic Review, and this week, the Southeast Asia Economic Strategy that was just released. So infrastructure is clearly a focus, but it's an area where there could potentially be differences between the different communities and how they see it. So our process is always about consulting and getting as many ideas and people involved as possible. So this process started a while ago. We started last November. We had a larger dialogue and background research that then moved into a smaller working group. We made sure that we were communicating with government the whole way along to get ideas about what was most of interest, most importance for government to look at. And now we're delighted to be able to launch this paper today. So for our initial dialogue, we had a really good spread of views. We had Roland Raja from Lowy Institute giving us a sense of the needs and the issues in the region. And then we have 3 of our advisory group members from different sectors giving a sense of what they saw. So, Joanne Wallace from University of Adelaide, Jane Haycock from IDCC, and Richard Maud from the Asia Society. We were then lucky that a small group put their hand up to come and have multiple consultations to work on a draft. And in the case of this group, to really work on the draft, to go in every sentence, make sure it was exactly right and really conveyed their views. And so if I can thank all of them, any of them who are here today, as well as the 3 who are going to speak to us about their impressions. So like all of AP4D papers, we start with the why it matters. We are writing for busy policymakers, and we have to say why this topic needs their attention among the jostling of many priorities. One thing I think we've done in this paper, which will be a useful tool, is we've taken a snapshot of Australia's current infrastructure investments. So that's across, for example, the Defence Development Cooperation Program and the infrastructure there, what we're doing in terms of our development program, and also what we do, for example, with multilateral banks. We've got a lot of case studies in there, so you can see in practice what we're talking about when we talk about being an infrastructure partner to the region. And we, of course, look at the risks and barriers, which we know they are there. We give a vision for what we think Australia's relationship with the region should be on infrastructure. And we have a first shot at what might be some principles for being a good partner on infrastructure with Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And we'll take you through a little bit more about the main parts. I think the thing that really struck me with this paper is that there are really quite different starting points on infrastructure from the different communities. So depending upon how you see infrastructure as an issue, you might see it mainly about excluding a strategic rival. You may see it mainly about building influence, or you may see it mainly about alleviation of poverty and human development. And depending upon which balance of those you see, you'll have quite different ideas of what success is and how we should measure that. So it seems to me this is an area where we do need conversation between the sectors to talk about that, to try to increase the coherence across the sectors of what they think infrastructure is even for before we get to anything further. However, we do believe there is a good core area of of consensus that comes across the different sectors. So I think everybody agrees that the region has infrastructure needs. In the recent Southeast Asia Economic Strategy, for example, it put the infrastructure needs out to 2040, and you thought, oh my God, that is massive. I think there's a view across the three sectors that, yes, we admit there is strategic competition happening, and that infrastructure has a whole range of effects, which can be social and economic development, reputation, influence, a whole range of outcomes that we have to think about. Now, we believe Australia can and should play a role in helping the region meet infrastructure needs. And most crucially, out of all the points here, that has to be responsive to the needs of Pacific Island and Southeast Asian countries. There's also a sense, I think, of the crowded space. We know how many partners there are working on infrastructure issues in the region. And that means there's an obligation to think about how our behaviour links in with them as well. So thinking about, for example, limited bureaucratic capacity of recipient countries, but also things like overall tech burden, which we can't just see in a vacuum. So our first shot at having a set of principles for infrastructure partnership, we put it in two parts. The first level is very much at the sort of policy level. So we're talking, what are the, the philosophy, what's the approach? And you can see there a range of ones that have been come up with by the fantastic working group. The other one we look at is around the implementation level. So the process and delivery that goes into this. And again, these are giving clear guidelines for what we think is good practice, good way of being an infrastructure for the partner for the region. Now, I didn't want to spend too long on those. I want to leave everyone still with some appetite to look at the paper more and to listen to our wonderful, wonderful working group members who are going to tell us a little bit more about what they found from the process. So if I can call upon and introduce Hayley Channer from the US Studies Centre, who's also one of our advisory board. Thank you, Hayley. Anna Griffin from Transparency International, and Alison McKechnie from John Staff International Development. Welcome, ladies.
Hi,
Thanks, Melissa.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Fantastic. So I thought what I'd start with is a bit of a sense of the needs, why we're talking so much about infrastructure and what Australia's role might potentially be. So Alison, maybe I'll start with you. If we acknowledge there's a significant need for infrastructure investment in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, can you give us a bit of a sense of the sort of types of infrastructure that Australia traditionally focuses on, and why those are important from that defence development diplomacy perspective?
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks for inviting me to be part of the launch of this topic, of something I'm very passionate about. As you know, there's no doubt that infrastructure needs in these regions are immense and diverse. In Southeast Asia, the economies are larger and more attractive to private investment, so the infrastructure needs primarily tend to be around project development, and we typically focus on policy and regulatory processes to support approval mechanisms, governance and project preparation capacity. In the smaller economies of the Pacific though, infrastructure investments are usually about providing basic services, so assessment of facilities and needs, designing and documenting works and assisting with procurement, and then providing oversight on construction. As a consultant and with the consultants that I work with primarily, we're usually engaged to work across all stages of the infrastructure delivery process. And that can be from the business case through the design and delivery and technical explanation of how the outcome might be realised, through to the construction, as well as the operational and asset management processes. The sectors are actually fairly traditional to what we see in the Australian market, but obviously they're primarily focused on development and security outcomes in this case. So we usually find that investments in building projects are usually to support health, education and justice, such as schools and police stations and hospitals, such as the project my company JID is involved in, which is the Angao project in Lae. Whereas the water environment projects cover a broad range of areas like water supply, quality sanitation, asset pricing and utility management. Transport projects are primarily focused on roads and highways, wharfs and ports, and they're becoming more focused on sustainable outcomes, climate resilience, of course, asset management, and the mapping and planning around road safety and safeguarding, as well as public transport priorities. And then, of course, the last one is energy and renewables, which primarily focus on, in the development space, electrification, microgrids, solar and hydro. But again, on pricing, planning and asset management in this sector, it's becoming a key agenda item in the Pacific, especially for countries like PNG. So it can be delivered as infrastructure projects are delivered as part of a large program of works. It's common in DFAT programs in particular that infrastructure is a subset or an outcome deliverable within a big policy program, whereas individual investments are common in multilateral and in defence programs, such as ADB and World Bank projects as well. And I guess I just wanted to finish with the having spent 20 years in delivering infrastructure and international development, I'm really conscious that there's a lot and very different diverse group of people working in the diplomacy, development and defence sectors. And they can find themselves on projects and they may or may not have technical backgrounds. So trying to manage the senior directives and the stakeholder expectations whilst understanding the process the technical teams are trying to undertake can be pretty daunting and frustrating in infrastructure delivery in this space. Infrastructure delivery is not easy or quick, and we all need to play a part in understanding the importance of getting the planning, the programming and the design requirements right in order to then meet the right financial and quality requirements. And we can support our partner and government communities with institutional strengthening capacity development in these areas. So that enables them to develop their own leadership and investment ownership opportunities. And of course, all projects start with an extensive stakeholder engagement process in this space so that the infrastructure is relevant, culturally appropriate and contributes to inclusive economic growth and positive social outcomes.
Well, I might continue on with that point. So, Anna, maybe I'll come to you. I mean, that idea that Alison's talking about, being responsive, understanding the needs of regional countries and being delivered in partnership with them. Why do you see that as being so important?
Thanks, Melissa. It's really crucial. I mean, in the project that I work on, we just finished up a visit from our colleagues from Solomon Islands and Indonesia, and they continually reiterated throughout the visit with all the people that we're meeting the need for infrastructure to be people-centred. And so that means that the partnership needs to not only be with the government that is making the decisions and the government that will be building the infrastructure, but the needs of the people directly affected and whether the project selected is the most appropriate for those people in that country. We know that corruption, that infrastructure is a highly corruption-prone sector, and the risk of undue influence skewing decisions in favour of vested interests at this early decision-making stage can be quite high. This decision-making stage can be quite politicised as well. So it's really important to ensure that to get the right projects and to avoid those white elephant projects, that we do keep that people-centred approach. There's a real need as well to really be doing that quality assessments, particularly environmental and social impact assessments, because if we don't do that, then we can see, the really adverse outcomes. So things like, displacement of people, environmental degradation, poor social impacts, and ultimately projects that don't benefit the people that we set out to benefit and that don't deliver those development aims. So it's really crucial that when we're thinking about partnership, that we're also thinking about the people, the citizens directly.
And for you, that's the people who are eventually going to use the infrastructure and making sure it meets their needs. Well, Hayley, things have changed a bit in both Southeast Asia and the Pacific on the infrastructure front. How would you describe it in terms of the changes that we've seen in recent years?
Thanks, Melissa, and really great to be a part of this panel. Before I answer that question, I just wanted to really encourage people who are watching to download the report. And the reason is because this will be a really valuable resource for years and years to come. In particular, on pages 8 and 9, there is a map of the region. It shows all of Australia's infrastructure investments in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Super, super helpful. I will be coming back to that again and again. And then also on pages 14 to 15, Melissa showed it in the slideshow, the breakdown of what people either from diplomacy, defence, development, or in the domestic context, that really captures why it's so difficult to do infrastructure, is because all these different government agencies are coming at it with different perspectives, different priorities, and different starting points. So I will be continuing to use this report because it is really so helpful. So to answer your question more directly, I mean, I guess this infrastructure journey has been one that we've really seen ramp up over the last 10 years. Probably not many people know this, but yesterday was the 10th anniversary of China's Belt and Road Initiative. 10 years on the 7th of September. And now we see China, which really was the catalyst for countries like the United States, Australia, Japan, and others to start investing in infrastructure. Even China is winding back its Belt and Road. It's not replacing it with its new Global Development Initiative, but it is definitely restructuring how it even thinks about delivering infrastructure and infrastructure financing. So then in terms just to say, you know, what have we done? What have we seen in the last couple of years? I think the journey Australia has been on infrastructure has been a real roller coaster of lesson learning. Obviously, DFAT is well aware of how to do development and aid in the region, but actually having defence come over the top of that and say, well, actually, there's a strategic reason we should be doing this. We should be investing in ports and airfields and IT communications, things that we need for strategic reasons. That creates another element to aid. It actually makes me think even about the competition we're facing in the climate change debate now. You know, even an area like climate change or development assistance you think would be a great thing for us all to cooperate on, we're finding a way to make it a conflict. Really frustrating, but in a sense, and like the report mentions, that's also good for developing countries because they can get the most out of developed, wealthy countries who are trying to gain influence in these countries. But then just kind of to wrap up, I guess, yes, we've seen an evolution of Australia's thinking in this space. We have the trilateral infrastructure partnership with the US and Japan. We have the Blue Dot Network, which this report provides an update on in terms of the UK is now part of the Blue Dot Network. The Blue Dot Network, which is essentially a certification scheme to say, yep, this infrastructure is really good, it's really high quality. The metrics for that Blue Dot Network certification haven't even been agreed yet, so it's kind of stagnating. And we see other initiatives between the United States and Europe, like Partnerships for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII, which is the worst acronym because it spells piggy. But basically, like, there are all these other initiatives, and a lot of the emphasis of Australia and other allied countries has been on the messaging and the branding rather than the actual doing. So yes, I think we've still got a long way to go to actually do more rather than just message what we're doing. Oh, Melissa, I think you're on mute.
Has to happen once a meeting. So can I encourage all the people who are listening in, please do start sharing your comments, your questions, and I'd love to get a bit more conversation going with our wonderful experts. So Alison, I'll come to you next. I suppose Hayley's talking, I think, about the complexity of this area. And I know in some of the things that Hayley's written, she's even asked the question, you know, should Australia be involved? Where should Australia be involved? I mean, from your perspective, what do you think Australia's strengths are? You know, where are we best placed to help address regional infrastructure needs?
Melissa, in my experience, Australia still has a reputation as a respectful and sovereign nation and a reliable trading partner. And we want peace and sustained growth within Australia, but also across the region. And so therefore, because we've got these entwined histories and have worked closely with our regional partners for such a long time, I think we've got a really good understanding of the complexities of the operating environment, and we know the risks, and we also understand the types of personnel that are required to coordinate infrastructure and deliver infrastructure activities. In my experience, our reputation in delivering well-designed, high-quality infrastructure is still strong. And I think we've got a lot of excellent administration, advisory and technical professionals in our industry. They understand how to use the right systems and tools to manage project complexities. And that is coming from, in most cases, a really good understanding of the Australian environment and what works well there, but also being able to listen and appreciate the cultural sensitivities that exist in the space that we work in. And most of the people that I work with know that if we don't understand and address cultural sensitivities as an integral part of the project delivery, it can mean the success or failure of these environments. So I think we've got some real strengths in that area. And I think those strengths create opportunities for deeper engagement and wider sector-wide planning and policy that enables better identification and resolution of broader national level strategy, financing, planning reforms, and building those partnerships that's necessary for those long-term outcomes. The other important factor is there's a couple of other things that are really becoming important, and Hayley alluded to as well, around security. And of course, helping to address climate change is one of those. It's acknowledged that the economic and security effects of climate change are going to sharpen and increase global stresses, and they're going to add to social, financial, political tensions around the regions. Many of the countries that we're working with, especially the small states, are looking for donor and agency and technical support to provide management and capacity development to plan for the effects and impacts that's going to affect climate change within their communities. So we've got a lot of strengths in this field due to our research and innovation, as well as our implementation of policy. However, climate change strategies focusing on sustainable design and resilient infrastructure are becoming a priority, but there's a lot of policy being written about them at the moment. And we really need to bring in more of our scientific and technical expertise, which we have a lot of strength in. And that can provide real design solutions to some of these directives. And I think if we're going to really support our neighbours and with our strengths, providing climate resilient infrastructure as part of our development outcomes, but seriously investing in collaboration and discussion with our environmental scientists and technical specialists are really going to help deliver scope of works rather than just policy directives. And I'm not sure we have the people in the industry at the moment available to provide the extent of focus that is being written about and talked about. So getting a lot more attention to those and realistic, achievable outcomes will be really important.
Absolutely. And so you're seeing both the current strengths, but also the strengths we could build over time.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of growth areas in some of the requirements that our neighbours need.
So I think that's the opportunity side and what we can do. I think, Anna, I might turn to you for some of the risks. So I know that Transparency International has been doing interesting work on the corruption risks in infrastructure. And can you give us a bit of a sense of, what are some of these potential negative consequences and how can Australia mitigate those?
Sure, thanks, Melissa. And just as a little bit of a background into our project and why we've developed this project, we know that the infrastructure sector is a highly corruption-prone sector. We also know that there's just a phenomenal amount of investment in the sector globally, as well as addressing a whole range of different needs, development needs, as well as strategic competition. But there's also a big gap between what is projected to be spent and what is needed. So it's something in the range of $15 trillion US, which is huge. But as well, because of the inefficiencies and corruption that happens in this sector, we think that somewhere up to around 30% of investment is lost due to those inefficiencies or corruption. So we think if we can prevent some of that at the early phase where decisions are made about which infrastructure is selected, then perhaps we can bridge some of that investment gap as well. So what we've done is we've developed an infrastructure corruption risk assessment tool that assesses the vulnerabilities or the risks to corruption in that early decision-making stage, looking at the governance frameworks, looking at the policy, and then looking at the particular project level assessments that we would expect to see on good decision-making. And when this is not done right, it can result in huge cost blowouts of the life of a project. It can result in white elephant projects that don't meet community needs. And a whole range of other potential adverse impacts, like I mentioned earlier, around poor environmental and social impact assessments and poor cost benefit analysis and so on. We've also done a little bit of research looking across the Pacific and to identify some key trends. And we know that governance generally is weak. The coordination at the policy level between the big development strategies and the key infrastructure planning documents could really be strengthened so that they speak to each other better and that they're really well prioritising which infrastructure projects are going to be built and thinking about how those are funded as well. There's a lack of transparency about what decisions are required to inform the decision to proceed with the project. And oftentimes that's not clearly articulated. And as well as that, there's also a lack of transparency around the particular assessments themselves and what has been assessed and how that's been done. So our tool is trying to then unpack that and understand that in greater detail. I think there's a really important role through the A program, and it does this already in many ways through through the A program itself, but also through other regional mechanisms to support and capacity develop the countries in the region to really strengthen that governance side and that policy side of it. There's also a role for government to support civil society monitoring approaches to ensure that citizens can hold their governments to account for the decisions that they make, that they can go through and assess how the decisions have been made and whether or not they do actually meet the community needs and benefit, provide the benefits that were set out in the aims of the project. So our tool can play a part in this civil society monitoring approach as well, but there's lots of other opportunities for civil society to get involved in that side of it, and it's a really important part, I think, in ensuring that we end up with infrastructure that really properly benefits the community.
Well, that figure you mentioned is really shocking. The idea that 30% of a project could be wasted if we don't have these things right. That's not something we'd put up with in most areas. And
exactly.
anytime,
it's not all corruption. It could be inefficiencies, but there's certainly a lot of room for improvement.
And transparency is a big part of making sure that that things are done the way they should be. Got it. Okay, well, I might go to Hayley then. We talked about the crowded environment and how many other actors are also involved in infrastructure. Some are ones that Australia, does have strong relationships with. Others might be a little more complex. What's your view on how Australia should be coordinating with other infrastructure partners in the region?
Yes, our coordination's a big one and a big problem, I think, because, we're lucky in Australia compared with countries like the US. I think there's about 6 different US government agencies that all have responsibility for different actual infrastructure programs in the Indo-Pacific region. And every time I, speak with Americans about Australia, Japan, and the US coordinating, Americans will say, well, it would be really great to know what, X department is doing in this space, and there's not enough domestic coordination. We're a little bit luckier because we're smaller. We only have the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade that's tasked with infrastructure. And I guess too, Department of Defence would need to be helping coordinate port developments and upgrades in the Pacific and elsewhere. But if you're not coordinating, then no one really has an idea of where exactly to plug the gaps. So I think of it as if you're trying to build a house, this kind of analogy, if you're trying to build a house, you need electricians, plumbers, engineers, painters, and a builder. And imagine if all of those actors didn't talk to one another about staging out different parts of the project. You just have this monstrosity of a house if you've got a house at the end at all. So the idea about coordinating is very important because I think, like Anna was talking about, the transparency is important, because if you don't tell people what you're already doing, you could be duplicating effort. And we will never get total coordination because a lot of the investments that China makes are opaque, and we just don't have always a clear view until sometimes something appears. But in terms of the countries that are investing in the Pacific very heavily, and that's Australia, Japan, the United States, they can do a better job to actually coordinate, but that does start with better internal coordination. And that will also lead to efficiencies in terms of how much money is spent. So it is really important. And the report actually makes a fantastic recommendation around coordination. Australia should take a proactive and responsible approach to coordinating with external actors on infrastructure in the region. It's a really important one to note. So I recommend people go in and understand through the report why that came about.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted that we're starting to get some questions in, and do put your questions down. This will be pretty much your last chance. If there's anything you're thinking, you'd like a reaction, a question, please put it in. So I might start with the first one, anonymous attendee, but we still love you. You've asked about the evidence base to show, whether Australia is an effective partner for the region on infrastructure. Do we have systems to assess and measure this? I thought I might go over to you with that, Alison, to talk about the systems. And I don't know if you want to come in as well, Anna.
We do have systems, Melissa, and if the anonymous attendee can get their hands on the international development policy that's just been released, you'll see that there is quite a lot of measures within that they're using then to set policy and agenda and strategy and priorities, of course, going forward. Within all of our programs in infrastructure, there is a significant amount of monitoring and evaluation that is done. And that is from not only the deliverables, but also through the social safeguards and the GESD outcomes that we're aiming for and trying to achieve. I can't put my hand on heart and tell you an exact document that captures all of that information, but it certainly does exist.
Fantastic. Thank you. Anna, do you want to come in on that?
I mean, I think our project is looking particularly at the different frameworks that exist in individual countries. So less so focused on, well, although looking also at Australia's policies and approaches too. I think there's, from our research, our cross-Pacific research, there's been quite a lot of work that's been done by Australia and other development partners to develop, in partnership with countries, their policy and legal framework in relation to large infrastructure projects. And that has been really great and really helpful, but there's still quite a variation in detail and complexity of those. And there are still some gaps as well. There's still some countries that are lacking some of those detailed overarching policies, and also some really important, things like, the procurement policies that are, required for large infrastructure projects that outline the detail around whether or not and how you would need to do a cost-benefit analysis and the purpose and need and environmental impact statements and so on. So there's definitely room for improvement. But yeah, there's already been quite...
There are structures, yeah. Fantastic. Well, I might give the next question to Hayley. So the question is, how does our current diplomatic relationship with China impact on the reception of our technical expertise when involved with infrastructure projects?
Wow, good question. Really good question. I think everything to do with our relationship with China at the moment comes through a strategic lens. I think I'm not an expert on China, but I know that China has decades-long plans ahead of it. And as a one-party country, it can implement that decades-long plan, whereas Australia cannot. We have to go from 3-year government cycles from government to government. And I'm sure that part of China's approach to infrastructure has been to export its excess construction capacity. We all know about Chinese ghost cities, so there's stories on it on the news all the time. So I see China's approach to infrastructure as having both strategic elements, but also genuine development goals and ways to export Chinese excess capacity. And I think also with Australia's approach to infrastructure, it has elements of all of those things as well. We're not just doing it out of the goodness of our heart, we're also doing it for strategic reasons. In terms of areas for cooperation on capacity building, this is a really difficult problem because Australia doesn't have enough technical assistance or capacity building experts to send to all the places that they are needed. But it would be a fantastic, I guess you could call it counter strategy. If Australia's real concern with China's Belt and Road was the low quality of projects, we could be sending more people in the capacity building space to advise developing countries on how they negotiate these infrastructure deals, whether that's with China or whoever. So I think it is a really good strategy to have more people in capacity building. Whether or not we could work with China on that, I'm not sure. I mean, I wonder if China would be open to that idea. Partly that would involve them admitting that their infrastructure projects are often low quality. And it is a point of tension for us and China, because you look at things like Solomon Islands. China just recently built this massive Olympic swimming pool for Solomon Islands for the Commonwealth Games that are coming up. And that huge infrastructure project will be used for about 2 weeks, and then it will become a white elephant for Solomon Islands because you have to upkeep that infrastructure. It's the same approach that Australia has used with the Pacific Patrol Boat Program, where we also do the maintenance on those Pacific Patrol boats. And just to sort of conclude my comments and give others a chance to say something, this is also something that was mentioned in the report. It's all about the costs of maintaining, the maintenance of the infrastructure. If you think about an infrastructure project as being like an iceberg, you only see the tip of the iceberg. Underneath it is the majority of work and money, where you have to keep investing in these assets over time so that they bring continued benefit to these countries. Hopefully that answers your question.
Oh, thank you. Well, I might go around just with one last, a pair of questions for each of you before we call on Senator Birmingham. I suppose, a number of people ask us what's it like being involved in an AP4D working group. So I'm interested from each of you, what you found interesting about being involved in the process, but also what message would you like a reader to take away from the paper? So I'll start with you, Alison.
Thanks, Melissa. Look, for me, it's been a great forum and a great way to connect with other professionals and colleagues who are delivering infrastructure across the region, and also an opportunity to share and discuss our experiences. I've really enjoyed hearing about the different perspectives and approaches and challenges. It's a massive sector, and it's given me a better appreciation for that depth and breadth of the different types of priorities that people have, and the way that people engage in delivering sustainable infrastructure outcomes and the complexities of delivering it. The messages that I have taken from the paper and working with the others is that whilst there's really different reasons why Australia may invest in infrastructure, well-designed, high-quality infrastructure outcomes that are based on meaningful dialogue and collaboration with our partners are a common objective. And it helps facilitate the development of our trusted relationships and building longer-standing partnerships. And that can be at all levels, but often at the highest levels, which really supports our security and diplomacy objectives as well. By working with our Asian and Pacific partners to assist them in their infrastructure priorities, we can actually help promote Australia's interests as well as our priorities and policies in a more integrated but also culturally sensitive way. And look, it doesn't matter if it's the design and construction of a building, a road, a water supply system, or a solar farm. All of those outcomes and infrastructure projects present a myriad of social and environmental challenges, and it's rarely as simple as just a pure technical outcome. It's an opportunity for multiple development outcomes that contribute to a nation's well-being, and ultimately this places us in a really influential position if we can do it well, and that we use the right people at the right time, we listen, we manage expectations, we work and collaborate to support the leadership of the communities and the partners whom we're working with, and that by doing that, we can be stronger because we can share the burden of leadership with our regional partners, which I think is really valuable.
Oh, that's beautifully put. And I think gives a real sense of the vision in the paper. Maybe to you, Hayley.
Thank you. Because I actually consulted on this paper and have been looking at this subject for a while, I actually was thinking about how, in the end, I feel like actually infrastructure is not the most important thing we should be doing to help. In terms of the best thing we can do for more infrastructure and better quality infrastructure is actually good governance. So the example that comes to mind is, Australian development assistance helped Papua New Guinea build a highway in its capital. Port Moresby. And then a number of years later, Chinese development aid built a massive 6-lane highway over the top of that perfectly functioning highway. And that 6-lane highway has been described as a road to nowhere. And that's because it doesn't lead anywhere and nobody uses it. And if you can imagine photographs of Pyongyang in North Korea, where there's highways that aren't being used, that is what that highway is like in Papua New Guinea. And the reason that that infrastructure that Australia invested in is kind of being literally concreted over the top is because there is not strong, good governance in Papua New Guinea. So to actually help infrastructure, I think we need to start at a more basic level that's about stamping out corruption and helping create strong structures and frameworks in developing nations. I'm not saying developing countries are the only countries that have corruption, so does Australia, but that actually could help infrastructure projects more than the infrastructure themselves. I think we need to start a few steps back.
I have a feeling Anna's going to agree with you. Over to you, Anna.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, absolutely. I think that's exactly the perspective that our project comes from. Going back to the AP4D process, it's been great to be involved with it. It's from the workshopping at the start of the key issues and key areas of concern all the way through to the drafting and editing of the document. It's been really great to connect with others working on these topics. Yeah, just to finish off, it's I think what kind of reiterating what Hayley already said, it's really essential that we have really clear, transparent, open processes for decision making, and to help ensure that people are central to these projects and these decisions and the outcomes as well. That when we have these really clear, detailed, transparent processes, it helps to reduce the risk of corruption or undue influence in the decision making. And ultimately, we hope it helps to result in projects that are more targeted, more focused on the benefits to communities, and also hopefully higher quality as well. So yeah, I think there's really important to ensure that those processes are transparent and more transparent. I think there's still a lot that can be done to open that out and to make it clearer and more open.
And thank you to all three of you and to all of the working group members who've been involved. I think if that doesn't get you excited to read the paper, have you telling you which pages to look at in the paper? I'm not sure what will. So thank you so much for sharing your impressions and the messages you want to take away. What we're going to turn to now is a policymaker response. So the audience for this is people who have the ability to hopefully make great policy for Australia. And we're very, very fortunate to have someone at the very peak of that ability, which is Senator Simon Birmingham. He's the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, and we welcome him and ask him to tell us a bit about his reaction to the paper.
Well, thanks so much, Melissa, and it's a delight to have the opportunity to engage again with AP4D and with some of the really important policy and research work that you've undertaken. I've been able to be tuned in for the seminar for all but I think the first 5 or 10 minutes. So I've heard most of the contributions, and apologies for just missing that start at the outset. But to Nicola, Hayley, Anna, Alison, it's been wonderful to hear your insights and to understand the contribution that you've made to the working group. And I was thinking shortly before Hayley mentioned the Solomon Islands of a discussion that I'd had only over the last week with somebody who was not long since returned from the Sollies, and perspectives they gave me when we were talking about the perceptions in the Solomons at present, questions around how our development investment is viewed and that of other countries, and most notably China. And it was an interesting perspective that came back to me, which was that for particularly older Solomon Islanders, Australia continues to be regarded for many of the things we've done over a longer period of time in underpinning development, security, seeking to invest in capacity and support across the sphere of development objectives that are undertaken. Yet for younger Solomon Islanders, they are seeing the glitz of the big infrastructure spend and the big infrastructure projects that China is leading in the lead up to the Pacific Games and has been undertaking, and that there was almost a "what are you doing for us, Australia?" attitude being undertaken. And I think that practical example, parlayed against, indeed, as Hayley identified also the Papua New Guinea road to nowhere question, that of course there will be questions that may be increasingly asked in the Solomons in months and years to come about whether these were the best possible investments. But it shows, in a sense, the challenge that exists. Why is there an increased focus and look at infrastructure in recent years? Well, the strategic competition there in part is driven by the fact that infrastructure is highly visible, it's tactile, it is something that people can see and feel and attribute directly to donor countries and supporters. And that's certainly why you've seen that drive, in a sense, to how we each engage in that space. But from an Australian perspective and viewpoint, as always, and it comes through very clearly in the paper and discussion just had, it comes back to the core questions about how we do so in ways that are ethical and effective, and that we meet those key goals and the many other principles that I'll come back to in a second. Certainly, I was pleased as Trade Minister, where there is a tangential role in some of these areas, but to play a role as the Minister responsible for Export Finance Australia, alongside Maurice Payne, who today, it's a notable day to pay tribute to Maurice's work in this space, and particularly the work we did together in establishing the AIFFP, and also working with others in the early stages of the Blue Dot Network. All of them identified in the paper here in terms of the contributions that each make. And late last year, when I had the pleasure of being on the bipartisan Pacific mission with Senator Wong, seeing some of the early projects of AIFFP, one of which stands out in Palau, investment in solar infrastructure in Palau that is helping their very small energy supply market move from diesel-based generation, highly emissions intensive, reliability challenges and expensive over the long run, to a very significant solar plant that is being built that can provide, we hope and trust, longer term benefits. And it's a serious commercial partnership that's been undertaken there, demonstrating the value of working very closely with the people of Palau, the government of Palau, but also the commercial and delivery partners to ensure the long-term effectiveness there. And more of those sorts of projects is crucial for the range of different benefits and the lasting benefits that they can quite clearly provide. I think for a policymaker working through the paper, turning to page, and I have to put my glasses back, I think it's 24 and 25, with the principles for infrastructure partnerships, they're crucial principles, and to pick out some of those reflected in the discussion and to put them in my own words, the criticality of how we ensure we are responsive, that we develop our infrastructure propositions based on respectful listening and engagement with those partners, and that we are, in being responsive, very much meeting the needs of partners. Now, those needs, of course, for many of our infrastructure and development partners are vast. And so prioritisation of those needs and understanding how we can get as many wins and advancements out of projects as possible is important. But also ensuring that it complements, as I touched on at the outset, and as was touched on before, our overall statecraft and strategy, that there will be a need as we look at how we are addressing genuine need and genuine outcomes to also ensure that it is appropriately targeted to complement other diplomatic efforts, other defence or economic projects that are underway, and to respond where necessary to the competitive landscape that we have. The transparency that Australia offers is a standout and a point of difference that exists relative to particularly China and some other investors. So transparent, merit-based, offering responsible financing, but amidst all of that, and I think it's important here, this is also reflected in the principles, how we make sure it's an easy process and pathway as well. Again, picking up on conversations in recent weeks, I had somebody talking to me about infrastructure and development projects in Africa at present, and increasing feedback from governments there. And of course, there are many challenges with many governments across Africa right now, but some of the feedback about how they are finding the conditionality of working with European nations to be such that they prefer the work with China and to pursue those projects. Now, we face that challenge there. How do we maintain those highly ethical and effective practices that we want while still making it easy? If at a 4D dialogue, if I can perhaps throw in there the 3 E's of ethical, effective and easy, and how we actually get the balance right across those. In terms of the pursuit there of the responsible financing, how we do that with partners, both partners in other countries, because there is certainly value to be had both in terms of being able to do bigger projects by pooling funds and resourcing together, but also crucial value to be had in terms of the diplomatic impact and effort and the benefit from statecraft of working with others. And to be very clear, we should be open to working with all. And that includes, if we can get the right type of high standards, focus on local needs, ethical and effective outcomes, to work with China, if we can actually ensure that we are achieving outcomes that genuinely benefit countries in a way that respects their own sovereignty and guarantees that they are achieving outcomes from investment that underpins that for the long term of the future. But partnership equally with the many civil society partners who have been crucial to the development of this work as well. So in closing, I do want to really stress just how much I value this type of work as challenging our thinking, as trying to guide us towards the types of principles that can help with the outcomes that we seek to have as an Australian government, regardless of who's in power, and the bipartisanship across this type of lens is very important. That the challenge for current government in delivering their international development policy is in making sure that it lives up to the types of principles outlined here, that it uses these principles as a way to guide decision making and to make that decision making as seamless for Australia and our work and the partner nations we're working with as possible, and throughout all of that to be building the type of capacity that you've heard in ways that means we can be a practical and visible player, but also one that is enhancing the capacity and capability of our partner nations to work not only with us, but with everyone across the region. Thanks very much, Melissa.
Oh, well, look, thank you. So that's a lot of alliteration for us. We've got ethical and effective. We've got to be responsive and respectful. We've got to be transparent. And then, as you say, easy, accessible, if we want to be a good infrastructure partner for the region. So thank you for distilling that so clearly. I'd like to thank you again, Senator, thank all of our speakers today, and of course, everyone who got us to this point, all of the working group members, our advisory group members, everyone involved in the process. And can I particularly thank, in absentia, Hugh Piper, who was the program lead, who brought this all to fruition, and who is, I think, literally on an aeroplane off to do his Masters of Public Policy at Oxford. We're absolutely delighted for him, but it's a big hole for us to fill now that we don't have him anymore. So if I can thank everyone who joined us today. We had a question on whether the presentation will be made more broadly available. It will indeed. It's been recorded and it will be on our YouTube channel. So please do share this talk, share the paper, share it on social media. And if I can say, do get involved. You can sign up to our social media, to our mailing list. We're very interested whenever we're working on a topic to get a wide range of views, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. So thank you again to all of our speakers. Thanks again to our funder, ACMC, and all of the AP4D team for making this possible today. Thanks again.